go? Okay. So in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Almighty God, we ask you to teach us by your holy word how to keep your word and how to live according to the commandments that you have given us, that we may grow in virtue. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So we just got started with the fifth commandment last time. So we talked about thou shalt not kill, which is a commandment that tells us that human life is sacred. And I know I mentioned from the time of Cain and Abel, Abel's blood was crying out from the earth. Noah, the lifeblood within man is sacred. And so from this time, from the very beginning of Genesis, the sanctity and the value of human life made in the image and likeness of God is very important. And so it becomes something that is gravely unjust to take a human life, without any reason or cause, especially to take an innocent life. We did talk a little bit about the idea of self-defense. So you can defend yourself, and so that can in fact be a time when it can be morally justified to take a life, but that has to be proportionate. We talked about that a little bit, if you remember that discussion. The death penalty comes up in that context. The death penalty itself is not immoral, because there can be circumstances in which you'd say, for the safety of society, it's kind of another self-defense argument. For the safety of society, there is no way to protect society because there's such grave evil here, short of that severe penalty. But in the United States today, and in our society today, and this is something that Pope Francis has, I think, clarified, is that we now have the possibility of incarcerating people and making sure that they do no further harm to society. So once you can say that they're no longer capable of harming society, then it's harder to justify that the death penalty is necessary. But I mean, in days gone by, you couldn't always guarantee that someone wasn't going to break out of prison, or that there wasn't going to be they could continue to wreak havoc, and if they were so depraved and such that the community was still in danger, that's the circumstance when even the death penalty could be considered. But anyway, it's more difficult in today's society to justify that. Then I mentioned some other things that would fall under the fifth commandment. Okay,
I just have a question, because you said it's further society.
Yeah.
They've committed murder in prison before, wouldn't that?
Yeah,
because that doesn't keep the people in that society safe.
Well, that's true. That's true. So let's say that you had, so to repeat the question, it's, what about other law-abiding prisoners? We're always concerned about the law-abiding prisoners, not the, can I say that? I would say, okay. I'm thinking of a movie line where that line was used, but it was used ironically, because they're like, what are you talking about? In that case, yes, it's not moral to allow someone to continue to do harm. And in theory, if they would be such a grave harm in prison that other inmates' lives are at risk, that's a danger. But this is where, and this is opening up another can of worms, which you're all very good at doing with your questions, which is fine. This is where the idea of solitary confinement would come in, or those very high security supermax prisons where you just, where you really do limit the capacity of a very violent inmate to harm other people. But that opens up another question, because in some of those situations, they say that, to be in solitary confinement is actually so destructive to the human person. You do wonder about the morality of doing that, because it can oftentimes leave them psychologically damaged, maybe even more so than they already are if they're such serious wrongdoers. So anyway, that's a whole separate debate, and that's beyond our class tonight. So other things that would qualify, I mentioned infanticide, so that touches on abortion. Eugenics is another thing. Margaret Sanger and the whole idea of trying to purify the gene pool, and so the idea of eugenics, of doing away with that which is inferior, that would have been part of the thinking behind the Nazis in World War II. So so all of that, of course, obviously is a very serious violation of the fifth commandment. So now to continue on with a few other things, here's a big question that comes up. where people sometimes do this is one where this can actually happen in different people's circumstances. It has to do with hospice. So let's say you have someone who is approaching death. Sometimes you'll hear us pray for a greater respect for life from conception until natural death. And so natural death, meaning that, okay, when it's time to die, there's nothing wrong with dying. All of us have to die at a certain time. Euthanasia would be taking a life prematurely, so choosing to end one's life prematurely. Now that would be immoral. And so the idea is that, well, we don't want to precipitate our own death, which is euthanasia, or kind of almost akin to committing suicide. But then what does that mean, that until a natural death? Does that mean that we have to live as long as possible? No, it does not. And so there are times at which you may have a person who has many serious complications, and treatment maybe is going to forego a person. Person might have cardiac problems as well as other problems, and they'd say, well, we're not going to try heart surgery. They might not survive it. Totally reasonable. That's a totally rational decision to make, and when a person has maybe that and other serious things. And so then they may have a little strap on the wrist, and so the nurses all see DNR, which is do not resuscitate, which means that if the person was to then have an attack or was about to pass, that it's okay to allow them to pass. You're not causing the death. You're also not trying unnecessarily to prolong life, because sometimes people might say that to deliberately prolong life when a person is in a state of grave suffering, that itself may also be immoral. So we're not obligated to prolong life, but we also should not precipitate death prematurely. Those would be the issues present. But I should say that if you had, let's say that you had a 30-year-old man and say an 80-year-old man. Let's make it 90. Let's make it 90-year-old. Okay. So say you had a 30-year-old man and a 90-year-old man. The 30-year-old man has a wife and children that are still being raised, and let's say both of them need, say, heart surgery. You would really say that it would be the moral response in the case of the 30-year-old man who's still raising a family, that he really should have the surgery because his family may still depend on him, and there's also a good probability or prognosis for a recovery where he can still contribute to the life of his family. But in the case of the 90-year-old man, or we can make it 100 years old, whatever age you like, okay. But where you'd say that there's heart disease and there's this and that and whatever. And then you could say, okay, in this case, not only would we not have surgery because it's not advised, but it is acceptable in that case to forego the surgery and even to accept death when it comes. So that's just a little comment on hospice and euthanasia. Sometimes with hospice, one of the things that they do, they then try to control pain. Can you control pain while a person is dying? What do you think? Yes. Okay, yes, you can control pain. But here's the thing about control. What do they oftentimes use to control pain? Morphine. Okay, and there are other drugs that they use on top of that, because sometimes actually the morphine stops working. There have been a lot of different times when I've accompanied people through that hospice journey, and sometimes I've checked in with them to anoint them or bring them. Oh, call the priest too when they do that. So make sure they get anointed. Make sure they get communion if they're able to consume, if they're able to eat. That they get absolved. So do that, because that's important as well. But here's the thing though, is morphine in a certain amount can control pain, but in an excessive amount can stop the respiration in the heart, so it can act. So it's one of those things, and sometimes people have a little qualm of conscience, and I'm not a doctor, so it's not my place to step into that, where that line is. But people want to be a little careful about not over-medicating, because you're essentially, what's to say that that's not bringing about or precipitating the death. It's a really touchy subject. I very much encourage people, if they're dealing with a loved one who's dying and they're trying to make these decisions, I would tell them, the loved one, I say, now you're not a doctor, you have to trust what the doctors are telling you. So listen to that medical advice, because you have to trust the person who's the expert in that. And so I really tell them, do what the doctors say. And in that sense, I'd say, I don't think that they should feel a huge sense of a moral quandary in navigating through that. But I do understand how people might be a little cautious, because sometimes they do kind of see that someone's just being over medicated, and that. So how quickly will they pass? That's actually a really tough ethical question that sometimes people deal with. But my advice, unless you're a doctor and know how to answer that question, my suggestion is then go to the experts and trust the doctors. You have to. I don't know how else you would make a decision like that, because it's beyond most of our competence. You have to trust the people who are experts in that. So, question? Yeah.
Okay. I've always been curious. If you have to have a loved one pull you off the ventilator and all that, is that murder for them?
No. So if you are withdrawing life support, in that case, what you're doing is you're allowing the person to die naturally. And this is where there's a distinction that's been used in the past, and I haven't heard it so much lately in modern medical ethics. But the distinction that's been used in the past has been the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means. So what are you obliged to do? You're obliged to provide ordinary means of support. You are not obliged to provide extraordinary means of support. You should provide food and water. If a person is just lacking, you don't want them to die of dehydration because you're not giving them any water. I mean, so food and water would be, a basic care. A respirator is extraordinary. Other surgical interventions, extraordinary. Even the crash cart, if you have the do not resuscitate, I mean, even the defibrillator, extraordinary if they're accepting their death. So being on a respirator is extraordinary, and we are not required to provide extraordinary means. So to withdraw the respirator is acceptable, and it's not causing death, it's allowing death to occur. In other words, the death would have occurred except for this extraordinary intervention. And sometimes people do that because something comes up and they're like, oh, well, maybe there's a chance or something. And then they realize after a certain amount of time that there may be very little brain activity, there may be other organ failure. And it's okay to just then say, okay, well, no, this is not going to change. It's not going to improve. It is okay to just accept death as an outcome in this circumstance. These are always really I'm speaking about it kind of clinically right now, and it's very difficult in the actual moment when you're dealing with a real person. And we always have to be sensitive to that question.
One thing I always advise people is make sure it's a decision you can live the rest of your life without having regret.
So the recommendation that a person make sure that the decision they make is one that they can live with for the rest of their life. I think that's probably a wise thing to think about too. Yeah, question?
I wonder about a person, say a cancer patient, who says, I'd rather not have chemotherapy.
Yeah, a cancer patient who might decline chemotherapy. I've also had a dialysis patient who has decided to withdraw dialysis, to not pursue dialysis. That would be another. I've had that actually happen. And so in both of those cases, those would be extraordinary. So we are not required. Chemotherapy is quite radical, and the side effects on that are pretty serious. And a person, we use the term quality of life, and that's a little bit dangerous because you hear that sometimes in the euthanasia thing where they say, well, they have no quality of life, so we're just going to put them out of their misery. But there is something to be said about. Let me use ordinary means, but I'll give you an example where this comes into play. So take, for example, hydration and nutrition. So the idea of food and water. Okay. Now, you can give a person water. You can give them the saline intravenously, or they, so you can do that. And water is always necessary. That's an important thing. You can also provide them food. You can do nasogastric too. You can actually, even if they can't swallow, you can introduce nutrition into the body. But here's the thing though, is that sometimes when a person is going through the dying process, their body starts to shut down. And people who are in hospice will tell you about this. And so there's a point at which they don't have an appetite. They don't want to eat because they're not hungry. And if you force food into the system while the body is shutting down, you're actually causing them to be uncomfortable because you're having food that's not going to digest. And so it's actually going to just sit in the stomach. It's going to actually be more of a discomfort. It's going to cause more pain. Or a person who is retaining water And then if you try to continue hydration, if you're giving more water into the body, then you're just going to cause bloating. This is really kind of a very clinically, very uncomfortable clinical discussion, isn't it? But those might be some examples where it's not like they lack water, or it's not like they're hungering for food, they're not. So that would be a point when you could just accept the fact that the body is dying and is not going to process the nutrition even if you give it. And chemotherapy, all the more so. A person could decide it's just too painful to go through. The reward for the risk, if a person is closer to death, and you say, well, but if you get the chemotherapy, you might live for another 3 years. You might not die of cancer for another 3 years. Well, yeah, but what about my lung condition that's probably going to take my life in a month? Okay, well then what's the point of the chemotherapy? So it is totally reasonable to take into account the considerations and the risks involved in accepting a treatment versus declining it, and also the benefit that you could receive, and also the pain or discomfort that might come with the treatment. Again, the 30-year-old man who has cancer should do the chemotherapy. Yes, it's difficult, but they have a prognosis of potential recovery that outweighs. So you'd say, well, there's some discomfort, but there's such a much greater benefit to be hoped for, as opposed to another situation with someone with multiple symptoms or who's close to death for other reasons. So good. Those are all good questions. You're going to be. I'm going to certify you all as medical ethicists by the time we're done, because I think you're. Yeah. So those are the questions.
I did have a friend that refused chemotherapy because of the economic impact on his family because he didn't have insurance.
The economic impact if a person refuses treatment for an economic. That could be a factor. That could be a factor as well. I think we would hate to think that would be that a person would not receive a treatment that they should receive otherwise, except for the economic factor. That would be a very sad situation. But if you were kind of weighing it, and a person was older and was maybe not expecting to live a long time anyway, maybe the economic factor just tips the scale a little bit more. I don't know.
He was 50 with small kids.
Okay.
Still, he decided to not.
Anyway, those are tough decisions. So let me move on from here. So that's hospice, euthanasia, things like that. Morphine. The idea. So going back to the idea of thou shalt not kill. Think also about the idea of scandal. Let me just shift gears entirely. Scandal is something that can show great disrespect for other people. So you can kill a person by you can kill their incentive or whatnot, or you can cause them great moral distress by giving scandal. You can hurt people. Remember that Jesus says, thou shalt not kill, but I tell you, don't even get angry. So even things where we can harm the other person, not by taking a life, but by harming them in another way, maybe not even physically, but we harm them emotionally, spiritually, mentally, or socially. So that could be by showing grave disrespect for another person. Discrimination would fall under this category. Anger, a lack of forgiveness, a refusal to forgive can also be to do harm to another person. That can be Fifth Commandment. We talk about our care for health. So think about this. Respect for the body. So we said suicide was wrong. But what about a person who doesn't take care of their body? So what about a person who doesn't exercise? Oh, are you sinning against the Fifth Commandment against yourself? How about that? Or the idea of a person who abuses food or alcohol or nicotine or takes drugs or engages in other reckless behavior. Is this doing potential harm to oneself? Now these are all things to kind of weigh, but these can all fall under this rubric of thou shalt not kill, even to do harm to oneself. So to hurt or to do harm to another person. One thing that is permitted, a person can donate their organs. So sometimes you might have a kidney transplant. That actually, so that you can say, well, you're doing harm to yourself. But yes, it's for a good for another person. And even the idea of donating the body to scientific research is also not, you'd say, well, it's disrespecting the body. Normally we would want to care for the body. But in this case, then the potential good that can be done for the advancement of science or to help another person is outweighs any harm. Those would be legitimate. So there's no opposition to that. other ways of harming another person. Okay, it's what about kidnapping them? Ah, yes. So even this way. So kidnapping, mutilation, disrespect for the dead. Oh, okay. So be respectful of the dead. Even abuse, verbal abuse, mental abuse. These are all ways in which you can say you're attacking a person and doing them harm. By kind of a sense of extension, it would all fall under disrespecting human life. It would all fall under the fifth commandment. It is an important thing for us to try to safeguard peace insofar as possible. Blessed are the peacemakers. So it is, in fact, a noble thing for us to do. The opposite of that would be a person who promotes or encourages anger, bigotry, hatred. These are all things that would be immoral. Peace is not just the absence of war. The person says, well, okay, well, we're just going to not argue, but I'm going to still be mad at you. It is actually the idea of striving for true peace and harmony and concord with one another. To take this also in a larger sense, we can think about societal violations of the fifth commandment. We have a responsibility, even as a society and as a country, as a nation, to avoid war if at all possible. So war is one of those things that is always a lamentable thing. Because of the grave harm that it does, and so it ends up really sowing division and hatred, and it can be the cause of death and destruction. There is a brief part, if you wanted to dive into this a little more, in the Catechism on the just war theory, which is the idea of what about the idea of self-defense? What if you have a situation where one country is unjustly attacking another, and you're coming to the defense of an innocent country? Okay, that would be kind of the idea of perhaps there could be a just war. So you're coming to intervene. I think it's a little hard to. It's hard at the time to apply something. In retrospect, when we think about what happened with the United States getting involved in World War II, we clearly would say now, in retrospect, that, there were such grave evils that were taking place, and so they had to be opposed, and so that was a moral act to get into that war. Because people did not know. It was until they discovered what was happening in concentration camps in Germany. Just the horrors that were there. So it was right to liberate them. That was a righteous cause. But the just war theory also says that you have to prosecute war in a just way too, which means trying to minimize civilian casualties, so you're targeting only those who are aggressors. It talks about the idea of that targeting efforts only against combatants that are fighting against you. What happens when the combatants take off the uniforms, though? Okay, so it's the just war theory kind of like lays out what you might call sort of like the rules of engagement or self-defense in a wartime situation. The problem, though, and this is where this gets very complicated and is beyond the scope of what we can talk about tonight, is when you get into, as in the evolution of war, when you realize that war doesn't always work the same way. And what happened in Vietnam when there were no clear uniforms being worn by the people to show what side they're on, how do you know? How do you know who you have? Or when you talk about the IEDs, the improvised explosive devices, and wars against the Taliban. So what do you do in situations like that? So what do you do? How do you fight a war fairly when your opponent isn't fighting war fairly? So it's like, why don't we all agree to the Geneva Convention and the just war theory? Okay, well, in war, they don't always do that. So that's a kind of a complicated thing, and that's just to sort of touch on just some of the issues, but that would be a separate topic for further discussion if you wanted to get into it or read that part of the Catechism toward the end of the fifth commandment. There's also a notion that it is important to support our national defense. It is totally reasonable for a nation to want to defend itself, but at the same time, the nonsensical accumulation of armaments is criticized in the Catechism. So building up weapons or stockpiles of weapons just simply to have more weapons is discouraged. So because that can also be a negative. So defend yourself, but and I think that where the Catechism is probably where they were going with this was the idea of the arms race and nuclear missile silos popping up enough to destroy the world about 8 times over. So they say, okay, that doesn't make any sense. So comment, or was that the one? Okay, that was the one you were going to ask. So yeah.
War be a
exactly.
part of
So,
that.
okay. So all of that is kind of just touched on briefly at the end of that commandment. So from here, I'll just move into the sixth commandment. Unless you want to say anything else. Hearing nothing. Okay, so we'll go on the sixth commandment. So this talks about now the sacredness of sex. Thou shalt not commit adultery. So the thing that is being preserved is the goodness of sex and the sexual gifts that have been given to humanity. So you might expect the Catechism to start with a very positive view of seeing God's plan written into humanity, and that's exactly how this section starts. So we go back to Genesis, and male and female God created Adam and Eve with a natural complementarity, so that from the union of the man and the woman, new life could come forth. And this is one of the fundamental goods associated with sexual intercourse. So with the sexual powers that we have, the capacity to bring new life into the world. At the same time, the Catechism also holds up the value of chastity, which means that the unbridled satisfaction of sexual desires oftentimes can then be disordered. So there is an importance of then reining that in and keeping that within its proper boundaries, which we would say is within marriage. So within marriage, there's a natural goodness that comes from the sexual powers that are used between husband and wife. But at the same time, we should also have an integral respect for the gift of sexuality and respect it for what it is. It can do great good when you see new life born, but it can also do great harm when it's misused, and that's actually why there are so many guideposts to give us to be cautious about ways in which it can be misused or it can go astray. So the Catechism holds up the dignity of self-mastery, the idea that we do need to discipline and master ourselves. So a person who lives an undisciplined life then eats whatever they want whenever they feel like it, plays video games whenever they want, whenever they feel like it, or whatever. And so to an extreme, if we give in to our desires all the time, then we end up becoming slothful. And if we give in to sexual desires whenever we feel like it and in whatever way, then a person becomes lascivious, actually, or is consumed with lust. So chastity itself is a moral virtue that is good to cultivate. It is also something that should be cultivated within a society or within a culture. Our society and our culture, I don't think, is actually cultivating this virtue. In fact, maybe very much the opposite. But it's something that should happen. And this is maybe what we might say is a responsibility that all of us, to some extent, have a share in. That these are things that we should promote and encourage. Young people, I think, are very much influenced by the culture and the society. So if the culture tells them this is okay, then oftentimes and some of these desires can be very difficult to resist, especially as young people pass through puberty. This can be a very difficult thing for them. And so it's good if the culture or the society aids them in developing a good sense of how they should behave. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that that's not true today, and that's actually very sad. That would be a situation where parents in particular, I think can and really should then step in to help try to counter the culture for your own children. So, and that's something that I think for parents is actually a very difficult thing these days. So that's a great challenge, and we should pray for parents raising children because of the challenges that are before them. Chastity, the virtue of chastity, which a person is chaste when they are using their sexual powers responsibly. Chastity is not the same thing as celibacy. So celibacy is not engaging in sexual intercourse. Chastity is acting appropriately for one's state in life. Married couples practice chastity in their sexual relations with one another, but by refusing sexual relations with someone that they are not married to. Similarly, people not yet married practice chastity when they behave in an appropriate way with other people, given that they're not yet married. So chastity is kind of responding in the proper way according to your state in life with sexual gifts. And when a person practices chastity and use those gifts well, it blossoms into a great blessing, and that is friendship. It's an interesting, there's actually a great saint, Saint Abelard, who wrote a whole treatise on spiritual friendship, It's just so there's a saint who goes into this at great length. But the idea of noble and healthy friendships, so a good, healthy friendship with other people. Sometimes I think we can probably all think of examples where where lust might be operative, or where there's kind of like maybe an attraction or someone or an affair or something. That's not the friendship. That you can talk about relationships that sort of have a sexual tension to them. When we're talking about the virtue of friendship, this is something that is a very integral thing. A person is filled with integrity. It's a sincere and noble desire for the best for another person. And friendships, in fact, themselves are actually always great goods. And are blossom the most between people that have great integrity and people of great virtue. So friendship is something, it's not just a status on Facebook, or we're Facebook friends, or I'm your friend. Okay, Facebook friends are that's not true friendship. Okay, so if you haven't learned that. Okay, so that true friendship is something much more profound. So chastity takes a different appearance for the single person, who's not married, but who maybe could be discerning marriage. They can date, for example. The engaged person who is preparing to enter into marriage but is not yet married. So that's a different state. For the married person, so married people who are in fact married and then capable of that sexual intimacy. For a priest who takes the promise of celibacy, so for a priest, priest cannot date, because I am not free to pursue marriage, so therefore it would be inappropriate even to start down that path. That's not something that a priest could do. Or religious, like we talk about religious brothers or sisters. So chastity takes a little bit of a different shape depending on each person. So now the sins against the sixth commandment, and this is where it's amazing how many different things there are. Okay, you name a way that people can figure out a way to derive sexual pleasure, they probably come up with something. This would include so lust, which is kind of the internal disposition. So a person looks at a person desiring them physically. Lust is something that tends to lead a person to look at another person merely for their physical qualities, to look at them only for their body, or to consider them simply as an object, as opposed to appreciating a person who is a living subject. So when you get to know someone, real friendship is you learn about another person and then you appreciate them as a subject, as a person who is body and soul. Lust tends to reduce the person merely to an object of desire, and looks only at the body. Self-abuse or masturbation, that's inconsistent with the purpose of sexuality, which is if you consider that what sexuality is destined for is the union of the husband and wife together in their marriage, in their marital relationship, and then also, if it's according to God's will, if this happens, then the procreation of children, as they can bring children into the world. But uniting husbands and wives, and then with the possibility of procreation or new life. If this is the ideal, then everything else contrary to this is going to fall short of that ideal. So masturbation would not suit that ideal purpose. Fornication would be sex between two people who are not married. Adultery is a married person who has sex with someone other than their spouse. Pornography, at the time the Catechism was written, I suspect, and then they do mention pornography, but boy, it's changed a lot since the time the Catechism was written. So the internet has changed things immensely, and that is really a very serious problem in the world today. So that really has exploded, and is much worse today than it would have been 20 years ago or 25 years ago when the Catechism was written. Obviously, things like prostitution would be against the sixth commandment. So to take advantage or to sell one's body, rape, to take advantage of another person's body against their will. Homosexual acts also cannot be reconciled with the purpose of marriage. So as marriage is between the man and a woman, so homosexual sexual activity would be considered immoral. There is a passage in the Catechism, though, that does talk about a great sense of sensitivity toward people who struggle with same-sex attraction. So, because there are people who may not, may not be able to control the desire that they have, and so they're called to then live a chaste or celibate life, because it's not moral to satisfy that. It doesn't lead in a fruitful sense to something that is positive. Nor is it something that sexual intercourse is beneficial when it actually then is he good for both parties? And if there's anything that would then satisfy one party at the expense of the other, then there's always something that's wrong with it. There's always something missing or incomplete with that. If I'm being, I might be a little obtuse there, so just if I'm not being too obtuse to say that. But at the same time, to be very compassionate with people who may struggle very greatly with this is in fact something that the church kind of holds close to its heart. So there are sometimes we all have at different times, I think, challenges that we face, maybe certain weaknesses we have in one form or another. And we may have other faults or other weaknesses in other areas of our life besides the temptation to adultery or toward the sixth commandment. And so the idea of having compassion for the weaknesses that one person may struggle more with alcohol addiction, and that may be the hardest thing for them. And it's always good, I think, to be compassionate to people who struggle but who are trying to do what's right, but may have great struggles. So that's the Catechism is very sensitive to that, and I think that's worth taking into account while not confusing the Church's teaching that the homosexual activity itself is not consistent with the sexual powers that God has given to us. Other acts that are not worthy of the dignity of marriage. Now, the Catechism is very good to not go into. Okay, I don't need should I draw you some pictures? Okay, the Catechism's not going to do that, so let's say. But we can imagine that, so if I can just be clinical a little bit, that, so we have in the ordinary sense that you would have regular genital sex, that is what is envisioned, that is potentially life-giving. Anything other than that, any other sort of you mental gymnastics, you think of, oh my goodness, so who does what to, okay. Anything other than that is something that is people may be surprised. There are people who would be surprised to hear me say this. They say it's degrading or it's debasing. And but for some people, I think can become very they can develop kind of fetishes or things that for them I think it's interesting to see how people can kind of like develop their thinking in terms of what they think or what they like or what they prefer. But I think sometimes we can kind of go down a road that's not really helpful for us. But in the end, I think some of these things, it's like, this is degrading in a way, and this is not something that is really helpful to preserving the dignity of marriage and the dignity of the spouses within that marriage. Okay, now I've been a little obtuse. If we turn the camera off, then I'll start drawing pictures if you want. Okay, that's a question? Yeah.
No, I don't need a picture.
Okay, no picture. Okay, no picture. That's good. That's good. Yeah.
I did write this down. I guess this would be the place to
Sure.
ask you. So I've heard Jewish people, some rabbis, mostly not, but people who practice Judaism say that all you have to do is follow the law and be a good person to be saved.
Mm-hmm.
And their view of the law, or their interpretation of the law, omits a lot of what is here because it's more internal.
Mm-hmm.
And their view is, I can think about it, I might even see it on HBO, but as long as I don't do it myself, I have not committed a sin. So
the
do you
quote.
think that that's a misunderstanding of what the law was that only changed after the events of Matthew 18?
So the question, just to make sure that it's recorded here, is that when you look at different Jewish interpretations, rabbinical interpretations, they would say following the law is a matter of observing the externals, and if what happens on the inside, if a person is thinking about this or whatnot, that's not a sin, or that's not going to keep someone from heaven if they, at least as long as they were externally following the law. I think that was certainly something that I think developed within Judaism because of their focus on the law. And there were certainly rabbinic traditions that I think kind of justified human traditions. Jesus even mentioned that. He says, oh, well, you have these your own interpretations, but that's not how it was presented in the beginning. What Jesus does when he answers questions about the legitimacy of divorce, for example, legitimacy of divorce, he goes back, he says, remember how God intended it from the beginning, and then he goes back to Adam and Eve and then tells them for this reason. So he actually brings them back, you might say, to an original understanding, and not what may have kind of developed as kind of a convenient misinterpretation over time. It was even said Moses permitted a bill of divorce because of the hardness of your hearts, but that was not what was intended from the beginning. And then also remember the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, do not commit adultery, but I say, do not even look lustfully at a woman. So Jesus certainly, that Sermon on the Mount, that would be Matthew 5, 6, 7. And then you have the teachings on divorce, which would be like Matthew 19 and other places.
Was that the first time that the law was explained in that level?
Was that the first time the law was explained in that way? I would have to think about that question because I suspect that there were times in the prophets when they would remind the people that, the observance of the laws, you say that you observe the laws, but your heart is far from me. So I suspect that the prophets may have also criticized. You can probably think of Ezekiel 37 as an example of that. So I think there probably are times where the prophets would have criticized that as well. But Jesus makes it very explicit, certainly in Matthew.
So this was always intended to be the interpretation of these laws.
I think so. Well, we would say that this is actually part of the natural law. So I would say yes. In that sense, it's been written into the fabric of humanity.
And Jesus warned about only washing the outside of the cup.
Right. Wash the inside as well as the outside of the cup. So it's not enough just to practice external purity, but to be internally impure. That's not consistent. The other thing, now this is a phenomenological argument as well, but you've asked the question, so I'll say this, which is that sometimes people say, well, I like to do this because this makes me happy. And this would be the rubric in which we say that morality is defined solely on happiness. Okay, in other words, well, this makes me happy, or this makes me fulfilled, so therefore it must be good. And this is where I was kind of talking obliquely a little before about how people kind of get all sorts of ideas about like what they think is good or pleasurable or desirable. And sometimes what happens is I think a person can kind of say, well, this really makes me happy. Let me change the example, and this might make it a little bit more obvious. So if a person says, well, one of the great pleasures in my life is to be able to drink alcohol. So I said, that glass of wine that I have with dinner, that just relaxes me, and that is that just helps put me at ease, and I enjoy that with the dinner, and isn't that such a wonderful thing? And so you can say that. Now, and that's fine. So you can say that, and that's okay. But if you were talking to someone who is polishing off 2 bottles a night or whatever, and they are drinking themselves into oblivion, and they say, oh, but it relaxes me so much, or they say, or that's I'm just taking care of my heart. That red wine is, which I mean, maybe in some small amount, but at a certain point, no, you are doing more harm to the heart. But we can sometimes get to the point where we justify in our own minds certain things, and I wonder, and we're really good at that. I think sometimes we're really good at rationalizing. And which is telling ourselves rational lies. That's a rationalization, is to tell oneself a rational lie. And I think when we really stop to think about the effect that certain things have on us, then we realize, this really isn't good. And I think, and that's what I mean about it being the natural law written in on the human heart, that ultimately we'd say these things don't lead to fulfillment or to peace the way that we said we seem to think that they do. So yeah.
And in Romans 1, it talks about the abandonment of function, right, between a man and a woman. So they're seeking after, men are seeking men, women are seeking women, which is an abandonment of the function of sexuality, which human reproduction is for human reproduction. Yeah,
so for the tape, that Romans 1 actually has Romans 1 has a great litany of all sorts of things that have gone wrong. And they can sometimes be, we sort of justify them, but they, especially when it comes to things that do harm, to marriage and to procreation. Yeah, Romans 1 actually has that's a good chapter to look at. Yeah. Let me just keep going here. So the purpose of some of the purpose of sexuality is also not only for fidelity and for unity between the partners, but also for fruitfulness. So the church is concerned that the use of contraception is against the value of fruitfulness. So one of the functions of sexual activity is to open the door toward procreation. So to deliberately shut that door and to deny the possibility of procreation is to take away one of the elements that's part of sexuality. So contraception, artificial contraception would be discouraged. That would be considered immoral. There is natural family planning, which is a moral option. It's one in which there's no contraceptions used. It's a couple just simply refrains from sexual intercourse during the fertile period, because there are fertile times and infertile times in a woman's cycle. So while she is still of childbearing age, and so you could make use of that by abstaining from sexual intercourse during the fertile time, and then engaging in sexual intercourse in the infertile time. That's natural family planning. So, okay, that's sort of a whole other complicated topic. But you were trying to ask a comment about that?
Because I hate to
No,
ask this
I'm not good at that.
Yeah.
Does the Catholic Church teach that sex is only for procreation?
Does the church teach that sex is only for procreation? No.
Well, then,
Because
what you just said sounds so much like the Garden of Eden.
okay, because obviously there are times when if you had a person who is just sterile, and take for example Abraham and Sarah or whatnot, okay, I mean for all intents and purposes they thought that they would never have children because they were sterile. So you're not required to conceive. It might not be possible to conceive. Certainly after a person is no longer of childbearing age, conceiving a child is not a possibility. And sexual intercourse between married couples in that situation is perfectly moral. So the observation here is to take an action by which we hinder conception. It's not the idea of that every sexual act has to have the possibility of conceiving. They don't all have the possibility of conceiving. It's artificial contraception by which a person deliberately hinders that possibility, as opposed to, you might say, accepting the fact that conception might not occur because of certain circumstances. It's a little bit like accepting death as opposed to precipitating death. The person who practices euthanasia is intervening to bring about the death, as opposed to the other person who's just accepting that death might occur. The person who intervenes to prevent conception, as opposed to a person who just is engaging in sexual intercourse, but who understands that conception will not occur because of medical circumstances.
Yeah, and in 1 Corinthians, Paul tells married couples do not deprive one another except by consent
And for a time, yeah.
For fasting and prayer.
Yeah, I think 1 Corinthians, I think that's 7, that talks about the idea of couples might remain apart might abstain for a time, but that they should not deny themselves indefinitely. Yeah, that's another good part. Okay, I'm going to just finish up the sixth commandment. Okay, one of the things when we talk about contraception, it is just to say and to say that children are a gift. And that, I think, is one thing that sometimes maybe gets lost when sometimes people think that they find out, oh, the strip turned blue, oh, I'm pregnant, oh no, my life is over. Okay, sometimes that thought may occur to some people, like they so fear pregnancy. But remember that having a child is actually a gift, and a new life that has been created by God and being brought into the world is not an evil. So there is something, I think, about just reminding ourselves of the blessing of children. Even in sometimes you could even have a situation of an unexpected pregnancy, and I still think it's actually a good thing to remember that this is a gift of God. Perhaps the right decision is to give the child up to adoption, and there may be a family that is just dying to have a child whose dream could now be fulfilled from that. So these are very complicated situations, but remember that new life is always a gift. So children are a gift. The last part of the sixth commandment Divorce is considered it's considered a sin. It's a cause of scandal against the dignity of marriage. But the Catechism also spends some time talking about how sometimes separation may be necessary because of the harm that could come to one of the spouses or their children. So there are circumstances in which it actually is the right thing for couples to separate, and the church, we might say, sort of tolerates divorce. But especially, whenever couples are having trouble, I never feel it's my place to tell them they should get divorced. That will happen. It's not, you could say it's not an ideal situation. So the Catechism is walking kind of a little fine line there, and to say that it's not a good, but sometimes it's tolerated as something that might be a necessity in a particular case, especially when someone is suffering harm, and that could be physically or mentally or emotionally. There could be a lot of factors going on there. So divorce is not approved of or encouraged, but sometimes we may have to accept that. And then finally, other things: polygamy, bad, don't do that, okay? Incest, bad, don't do that, okay? Child abuse obviously is a grave, grave offense against the Sixth Commandment, as well as the idea of, free unions, people who just, are intimate with one another without the benefit of marriage, or people who have what you might sometimes call a trial marriage. That's the phrase used in the Catechism. But that would be the idea of couples cohabiting before they get married. We're just going to kind of play house, or just simply have a sexually intimate relationship without the benefit of marriage. Those would all be against the principles of the Sixth Commandment. That brings us to the end of the Sixth Commandment. Okay, I'm going to suggest that, and that's 8 o'clock, we're just after 8. So 7, 8, 9, and 10, I'm going to come back in 2 weeks, and I'll use that time. So glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.